Have you ever wondered what really happened when Smaug fell into the waters of Long Lake? They say that at that instant the world fell silent, a silence so profound that even the mountains seemed to hear. But what almost no one knows is that the dragon's last breath carried not only fire and destruction, it carried with it a secret that began before the stars existed, a forgotten pact between the Creator and the first Lord of Darkness, Morgoth. And in the midst of this web of destinies were names that changed the course of Middle-earth. Thorin Oakenshield, the king who believed he mastered gold, Bard, the archer carrying a black arrow and an even darker destiny, and of course Smaug, the last guardian of chaos, whose death broke an invisible thread that linked the world to the very origin of fire. While everyone saw only the end of a monster, something much deeper was happening. An ancient wound was being healed, and the entire universe seemed to breathe again. The gold, the elven stones, the Arkenstone. None of it was just treasure. Everything there pulsed with the energy of a fire that belonged to no one, and when Smaug fell, that fire sang again in the shadows of time. Now, before we continue this journey, tell me something. Where are you listening to me from right now? And what time is it where you are? I like to imagine where in the world this story is finding you. And if this beginning has already made you feel the weight and beauty of this mystery, take advantage and subscribe to the channel here. That way you won't miss the next revelations of Middle-earth. Also, leave your like. It helps keep this flame burning and shows me that you want to continue exploring this world with me. When Bard's black arrow pierced Smaug's chest, the sound that echoed across Long Lake was not merely the roar of a wounded monster, it was the crack of the world readjusting itself. The flames that engulfed the dragon's body illuminated more than the night. They revealed the end of something that had been burning since the first days of creation. The people of Esgaroth saw only the fall of a colossal creature, but in the subtext of that moment lay a secret that not even the wise elves dared to record. The fire that died out in Smaug did not belong to him alone. It was the last breath of a power stolen from the foundations of the world, a spark that had defied the harmony of Eru's own music. For centuries, dragons were the living reminder of primordial chaos, proof that creation could be corrupted and transformed into destruction. Each beat of their wings made the air vibrate with the echo of the first mistake, the one that began when Morgoth decided to imitate divine power. And in that instant, when Smaug plummeted from the sky in flames, that echo ceased. It was not merely the death of a scaly beast, but the closing of a cosmic cycle. The waters of the lake extinguished not only the dragon's fire, but also the last vestige of the spark that Morgoth had stolen. From Eru, the undying fire. What few realize is that Tolkien left clues to this in his letters and notes, small hints that Smaug's death marked the end of a dissonance in the music of creation. For ages, the world tolerated the presence of dragons as a silent reminder of imperfection. They were the crack in the melody of the universe, the wrong note that for some reason insisted on remaining. But everything in creation tends toward balance, and when the last roar echoed over Erebor, it was as if Middle-earth finally breathed a sigh of relief. In the tales of the dwarves, it was said that the kingdom's gold had a different sheen after the dragon's fall. Colder, more lifeless. As if the treasure, once alive with the warmth of a spiritual force, had lost its soul. And perhaps that was true. For the gold, jewels and relics that Smaug guarded were not mere objects of covetousness. They were receptacles of energy, fragments of the original fire that sustained the existence of these creatures. When the dragon died, these fragments scattered, returning to the invisible cycle of the world, like leaves scattered by the wind. There's a detail that few notice in Tolkien's stories. The world always reacted to the death of powerful forces. When Morgoth was defeated, the sky split open and the lands shifted shape. When Sauron fell, time itself seemed to hesitate. And when Smaug died, Middle-earth fell silent. There were no earthquakes, no lightning, just a strange, heavy silence, as if even the mountains mourned the loss of something that, though dark, was part of the machinery that moved reality. This silence was the world's true mourning. Some scholars of Valinor have even suggested that Smaug was more than a monster. He was a link between the physical and the spiritual, a bridge connecting the power of creation to the power of destruction. His fall represented the definitive breaking of this bridge. The dragon's fire did not merely burn wood and stone, it altered the very fabric of matter. It was a reflection of the original fire that gave life to existence, now corrupted and imprisoned in a body of scales and greed. In dying, Smaug released this fire, and with it ended the last cycle of imbalance inherited from Morgoth. But this liberation came at a cost. The world, freed from its former dissonance, also lost a part of its inner flame. Kingdoms grew colder, the winds calmer, and magic, the kind that flowed naturally through forests and mountains, began to dwindle. It's as if the disappearance of the dragons took with it the last vestige of the world's infancy, when everything was more intense, more dangerous, and, paradoxically, more alive. What remained was order, stability, but also emptiness. Smaug, in his arrogance, believed himself to be eternal. He said, "I am fire, I am death." Perhaps without realizing it, he was telling the truth. Because when he died, the death of fire followed him. Not just literal fire, but the symbol of the raw, creative force that moved the ages. Humanity, the elves and the dwarves, inherited the ashes, and with them the task of rebuilding a world that no longer roared, it only whispered. And if the silence after Smaug's fall seemed like peace, perhaps it was only the interval between two chords. For the universe never tolerates emptiness for long, and the place a dragon occupied will, sooner or later, need to be filled by another force. Perhaps more subtle, perhaps more dangerous. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what Smaug carried within him was not just fire, but the secret of how gold, precious stones, and desire itself became spiritual fuel. And understanding this is understanding not only the death of the last dragon, but the reason why the gold of Middle-earth still seems to shine as if it holds a soul. Among the many mysteries of Middle-earth, few are as profound as the relationship between dragons and gold. In the eyes of men, those creatures were slaves to greed, monsters that amassed riches purely out of vanity. But Tolkien, with his silent way of hiding truths in symbols, left clues that gold was not just treasure. It was a living organism, a conduit for something much older than matter itself. When Smaug plunged into the gleam of his coins, he was not merely satiating his covetousness, but connecting to a primordial energy, something that came from the dawn of creation, when the undying fire still danced freely in the heart of Ilúvatar. Think of gold not as a metal, but as a condensed memory of light. In his most symbolic writings, Tolkien described the gleam of gold as a distant echo of the divine flame, the spark that transformed the music of the Ainur into physical reality. And that is why dragons sought it desperately. Each coin, each ruby, each elven stone emitted a vibration that resonated with the fire within them, a kind of silent symphony between creature and element. Without this connection, their hearts grew cold. Gold was, in essence, the food of the draconic soul. Some say that when Smaug slept upon his treasure, he didn't truly rest. He absorbed drop by drop the energy contained in that golden glow. It was an unconscious ritual, an ancient symbiosis that united creature and creation. And perhaps that's why, when Bilbo stole a simple goblet, Smaug awoke in fury. The theft of a piece wasn't a material offense. It was the disruption of an energy circuit. The absence of that object left a void in the spiritual flow that sustained the dragon. It was as if an invisible vein connecting his heart to the power that kept him alive had been torn out. The dwarves, in their most veiled legends, always suspected this. They knew that gold possessed life, and therefore treated it with almost religious reverence. For them, mining was not just work. It was invoking memories dormant in the womb of the earth. Each stone pulled from the depths carried echoes of Iru's music, remnants of a sacred fire that the Valar never managed to replicate. The dragons, created by Morgoth, were molded precisely to corrupt this energy. They did not merely accumulate gold, they profaned it, transforming light into shadow, creation into consumption. The relationship between gold and fire goes beyond metaphor. Symbolically, gold represents light-made matter. It is the petrified sun, the song that has solidified. When a dragon lay upon a mountain of coins, it was, in a way, returning to the womb of the universe, embracing the primordial energy from which it was made. Tolkien never explained this directly, but the parallels with Norse mythology and Christian tradition are clear. That which shines always attracts that which was made of darkness. And Smaug was the very shadow of light. There is something profoundly human in this cycle. Like dragons, we too are drawn to that which reflects power, be it literal gold or modern symbols of conquest and status. The shine awakens a sense of transcendence, as if touching something valuable could restore our lost sense of purpose. This is the hidden truth in the myth of Smaug. Greed is born not only from avarice, but from the unconscious desire to reconnect with the divine. When a being is made in the image of light and turns away from it, everything that shines becomes temptation. Behind the scenes of the story lies a tragic irony. The dragons, by accumulating gold, believed they were strengthening their own immortality. But each mountain of treasure they amassed made them prisoners of an invisible chain. The gold did not belong to them, they belonged to the gold. The energy that sustained them was the same energy that slowly consumed them, draining their vitality. That is why Smaug slept for centuries and awoke weakened. With each cycle, his inner flame grew less intense. He believed he possessed the gold, but it was the gold that possessed him. This inversion is a direct reflection of the philosophy that Tolkien explored so much. Power, when not in balance with purpose, becomes a prison. Gold was the perfect mirror of this idea. It could sustain the beauty of the elves, inspire the art of the dwarves, but also nourish the pride of kings and the madness of dragons. It was proof that the same energy that builds can destroy, depending on the consciousness of the one who touches it. And Smaug, who never understood this principle, became the ultimate example of a creature who confused brilliance with eternity. When Bard killed him, and the gold was left scattered among the ruins of Erebor, a subtle transformation occurred. The coins lost the vibrant sheen they had possessed, while Smaug breathed upon them. It was as if the metal had lost its pulse. This was because, without the dragon, the energy had ceased to circulate. The symbiosis had been broken, and in that instant, the gold became just gold again, cold, mute, and without purpose. But the mystery doesn't end there. There are theories that some of this gold remained, magnetized, vibrating in harmony with the primordial fire. This is why the dwarves who returned to Erebor felt a spiritual weight when touching the riches. They said the stones seemed to whisper, as if a fragment of the dragon's soul still remained within them. Perhaps this explains Thorin's distant gaze, his growing obsession, and the madness that consumed him. The curse of Smaug's gold wasn't in the coins themselves, but in the dormant energy they carried, the reflection of the undying fire. Distorted and hungry, this is the true secret of living gold. It was never merely a symbol of wealth, but a boundary between the divine and the corrupted, between what shines and what burns. Gold is the lifeblood of creation, and every time it is coveted, a piece of that light is torn from the balance. Tolkien didn't write about this explicitly, but everything in his work points to this duality. Nothing that possesses light is free from shadow. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because the fire that slept beneath the mountains of gold was not merely a metaphor, it had origin, purpose, and consequence. And to understand why gold fueled the dragons, it is necessary to unravel what the undying fire truly was, and why Ilúvatar never allowed anyone else to possess it. Before there were mountains, seas, or stars, before time even began to be counted, there was only sound, the music of the Ainur, and at its center burned an invisible flame, the undying fire. It was the spark that made creation possible, the breath that separated being from nothingness. Tolkien describes this fire as the most sacred gift of Ilúvatar, the force that grants true life and free will. No creature, not even the Valar, could create on its own without it. Only Eru, in his unattainable essence, possessed the power to ignite what existed only in thought. And it was precisely this that provoked the first rebellion in the universe, the desire to possess what could not be possessed. Morgoth, the mightiest of the Ainur, was the first to defy this order. Driven by pride and a thirst for creation bordering on the divine, he sought the undying fire in the depths of the void. His desire was not merely to create, it was to rival. He wanted to shape reality with his own hands, to give life to his own thoughts, to be the god of a world made in his image. But the fire was nowhere to be found. It was with Eru, and Eru did not share it. So Morgoth did the unthinkable. He attempted to steal fragments of the original flame. Some say he managed to touch the edges of this power, enough to warp the fabric of creation and generate new creatures, but all marked by corruption and incompleteness. It was from this theft, this profanation, that the first dragons were born, not as children of fire, but as distorted reflections of it. Each dragon carried within itself a stolen spark, a glimmer of the undying fire warped by ambition. It was a living energy, but poisoned. The heat emanating from its entrails was not merely physical, it was spiritual, a flame that consumed the world around it and itself. This is why the dragon's fire could melt the rings of power, set mountains ablaze, and leave marks that even time could not erase. They were, in essence, the reminder of the original theft, proof that even light, when diverted from its purpose, transforms into destruction. Behind the scenes of creation, this transgression had profound consequences. By violating the harmony of the music, Morgoth introduced a dissonant note into the symphony of the world, an error that could never be fully corrected. The stolen fire not only gave rise to powerful beings, but also altered the cosmic balance. Each time a dragon was born, the universe bowed slightly, as if trying to absorb the impact of a power that should not exist. Tolkien himself suggests, in his most symbolic writings, that the fire of dragons was a visible manifestation of the wrath of the gods, a reminder that creation, when tainted by vanity, carries within itself the germ of destruction. The elves knew this. They called the dragon's fire impure flame, not out of fear, but out of understanding. For them, there was no difference between power and responsibility. The life-giving fire can also consume everything it touches, and he who tries to mold it outside the will of Eru ends up being consumed by it. Dragons were creatures condemned from birth. The more they used their power, the further they strayed from the pure spark that originated them, until only soulless fire remained, the heat of corruption. Smaug, the last and most cunning of them, was the ultimate expression of this paradox. Within him burned the flame of a god, but his heart beat with the ego of a thief. He believed that fire was his, that power made him invincible. But fire never belonged to anyone. It was alone, a fragment of something much greater, and every attempt to control it was destined to fail. When Bard's black arrow struck him, the universe merely claimed what was due to it. The spark returned to its origin, and the matter that was not worthy of containing it was reduced to ashes. The great revelation here lies not in the dragon's death, but in what it represents. Fire is a metaphor for creation, and all creation requires balance. The same principle applies to any form of power, be it that of a god, a king, or a simple man. When the desire to possess replaces the desire to understand, power becomes poison. Morgoth believed he was gaining freedom, but in reality he forged his own prison. Each creature born from his theft was a reminder that not even divinity is immune to the consequences of choice. Undying fire, in its original purity, symbolizes free will and consciousness, the spark that allows creatures to choose, create, and love. But dragons, molded from corrupted fragments, inherited only the instinct to dominate. They did not know how to create, only to consume. This is the difference between the light that warms and the flame that destroys. And it was this imbalance that marked the entire journey of Middle-earth, a constant battle between the power that illuminates and the power that burns. What's fascinating is that this concept transcends Tolkien's universe. It speaks to us. How many times, in the pursuit of creating something grand, be it a work of art, an idea, or a better life, do we end up being consumed by the very fire we lit? The same impulse that generates beauty can generate destruction if the purpose is lost. The fire that belongs to no one is also the fire that lives within each of us. The desire to control the uncontrollable, to hold in our hands the force that can only be understood, never possessed. And so, dragons became a mirror of our own contradictions. They represent the brilliance of genius and the weight of arrogance, the thin line between creation and downfall. When Smaug died, the world lost more than a creature. It lost a living reminder of the power. Born from error, but that power, that stolen spark, never completely disappeared. It remains in the world, hidden in symbols, in legends, perhaps even in every ambition that awakens within a human heart. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the true meaning of the undying fire is to understand the very mechanism of creation. And when we look at dragons through this lens, we discover that they were not just monsters of mythology, they were the first mirrors of what happens when light tries to become its own master. Among the echoes of the first song of creation, there were notes that sounded louder, deeper, almost disobedient. They belonged to creatures not born to serve, but to test the limits of harmony itself. Thus arose Glaurung and Calagon, and finally Smaug, Tolkien's dragons. They were not merely beasts or symbols of destruction, they were consciousnesses molded for an unsettling purpose, to challenge the balance. In their presence, the world seemed to tremble not only from fear, but from recognizing in them an error that somehow was part of the very melody of creation. The fire within them was the sound of dissonance made alive, a reminder that not even perfection is immune to chaos. Glaurung, the first of all, known as the father of dragons, was the archetype of this rebellion. He didn't need wings to dominate, because his strength came from within, from his mastery over fear and lies. With a single word, he shattered kingdoms. corrupted hearts, and distorted the destiny of heroes. His voice didn't roar, it bewitched. It was as if chaos itself had learned to speak. Tolkien describes him as cunning, manipulative, a being who represented the psychological side of destruction. Glaurung didn't just burn cities, he set fire to certainties, and that's what made him dangerous. True chaos rarely shouts, it whispers. Then came Ancalagon the Black, the greatest of all. If Glaurung was the mind of chaos, Ancalagon was its physical manifestation. His body was vast enough to eclipse stars, and his flight made mountains tremble. During the War of Wrath, he was Morgoth's ultimate weapon, the final chord of rebellion. But even he could not withstand the force of restored harmony. When Ancalagon fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, the impact was so colossal that it redrew the map of the world. It was the universe responding in kind to the affront, as if to say, chaos has power, but not permanence. This battle was not merely a war between armies, but a living metaphor for the fate of all that is born from disorder. Smaug, in turn, was the last echo of that power. Smaller in size, but not in essence, he carried within him the legacy of the ancients. He didn't need to destroy worlds. Corrupting souls was enough. His cunning was refined, almost human. The way he protected his gold, the way he tested Bilbo with words, everything about him showed that chaos had learned to use intelligence, irony, and charm as weapons. Smaug was chaos disguised as elegance, fire wrapped in silk. Unlike those who came before, he didn't see himself as an aberration, but as a king. The problem is that even chaos, when it settles on the throne, forgets that it was born to challenge, not to rule. These three beings form a dark trinity within Tolkien's legendarium. Each represents a facet of imbalance, deceit, brute force, and vanity. Together, they compose an inverted mirror of the powers of creation. If the Valar were the architects of order, the dragons were the engineers of entropy. They existed to keep alive the tension between light and shadow, between control and freedom. And perhaps that is why the world allowed them to exist for so long, because chaos, though dangerous, is also necessary. Without it, the music would be too predictable. But there is something deeper in this symbolism. Tolkien, with his almost philosophical view of existence, seemed to understand that chaos was not a mistake, but an essential part of growth. The stories of the dragons remind us that balance is not born from the absence of conflict, but from coexistence with the unpredictable. Glaurung, with his lies, forced heroes to confront truths they would never have sought. Ancalagon, with his fury, marked the limit of the gods' power. And Smaug, with his greed, exposed how even noble hearts could be corrupted by desire. Each of them, without realizing it, helped the world to evolve. The dragons, therefore, were more than monsters. They were unwitting teachers. Their presence reminded the peoples of Middle-earth that power is a mirror. It reveals, but it also distorts. They showed what happens when creation loses its purpose and falls in love with its own strength. Morgoth created them to serve, but they did not bow down completely. Even in chaos, there was awareness. Even in destruction, there was a kind of hidden purpose, as if the fire within them knew it could not last forever, and yet chose to burn until the end. And when the last of them fell, the world fell silent. But this silence was not merely the end of a threat, it was the echo of a lesson. Middle-earth had witnessed the raw power of disorder and understood that nothing, not even perfect harmony, can exist without the memory of that which challenges it. The universe, in its wisdom, allows chaos to exist not as punishment, but as a reminder of the fragility of balance. Ultimately, dragons are symbols of transformation. They represent the moment when creation confronts its own reflection and must decide whether to continue growing or destroy itself. Glaurung, and Callaghan and Smaug are archetypes that transcend myth. They are the force that breaks patterns, the impulse that moves the improbable. They are the mistake that makes the symphony reinvent itself, and no matter how much the world has tried to extinguish them, their energy still vibrates invisibly in every fire that is born, in every bold decision, in every act that breaks with the predictable. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because if chaos was necessary for the world to learn balance, then perhaps the dragons haven't disappeared completely. Perhaps they've only changed form, awaiting the right moment to awaken in other hearts, with other voices, and under new flames. When Smaug fell, the flames that consumed his body illuminated something far greater than the death of a legendary creature. That instant was the closing of a cycle that had begun long before the dwarves, the elves, or even the stars. It was the moment when the music of the Ainur, the melody that shaped the universe, corrected the dissonant note that had been introduced into creation by Morgoth, the first and greatest rebel. The dragon's fall was, in fact, the final chord of a conflict that had been echoing since the beginning of time, the moment when the universe finally breathed in harmony after ages of invisible tension. Smaug's final roar was not merely a cry of pain, but a sound of liberation. It was as if the world itself were saying, "Now the wound is healed." The idea that reality is a song is not merely a poetic metaphor in Tolkien's work. It is the essence of his universe. The music of the Ainur was the divine chant that Eru Ilúvatar used to give form to existence. Every creature, every mountain, every breath of wind carries within itself a fragment of this melody. But when Morgoth decided to play his own song, distorted by ambition, he introduced the first mistake, a note that did not fit into the whole. From this dissonance was born chaos, pain, and eventually dragons. They were the materialization of the corrupted sound. Fire transformed into pride, creation transformed into possession. And for millennia, this wrong note echoed, reverberating through wars, tragedies, and falls. Smaug, the last of the dragons, was the last living echo of this distortion. Each beat of his wings was a reminder of Morgoth's arrogance, each spark of his fire a repetition of the distorted melody. But the harmony of the universe, though patient, is never lost. The original music always seeks to return to balance, and Smaug's fate was precisely the endpoint of this quest. When Bard's arrow pierced his heart, it was not merely an act of heroism, it was a correction. The dissonance that had vibrated since the first rebellion finally ceased. The dragon's death was neither vengeance nor punishment, but purification. It's curious to think that Tolkien himself saw evil not as something absolute, but as a distortion of good. Morgoth didn't create fire, he only corrupted it. Similarly, dragons weren't inventions out of thin air, but deformations of a divine principle, the life-giving heat transformed into destructive flame. The universe, therefore, couldn't simply eliminate this energy. It needed to transform it back into harmony. And that's exactly what Smaug's death represents. The moment when fire, finally freed from corruption, returns to its original melody. There is a profound symbolism in this. Imagine the universe as a vast symphony, and each creature, each decision, each act of courage or pride as a note played within it. For ages, dragons were the out-of-tune instruments in this orchestra, intense, fascinating, but out of sync with the whole. When the last of them fell silent, the music settled, and a vibration of peace spread throughout Middle-earth. That is why, after Smaug's fall, the world seemed calmer, more stable. The great forces of darkness began to disperse. It was as if creation itself had sighed, grateful to be whole again. But harmony is never achieved without loss. The disappearance of the dragons took with it a part of the world's ancient strength, that wild, dangerous, and magnificent intensity that reminded people of the power of primordial fire. Healing always demands a price, and the price of purity was the loss of mystery. The dwarves rebuilt Erebor, men prospered, but the magic of air, fire, and fear that once permeated the north vanished. The world became more ordered, but also more silent. Chaos had been banished, but along with it went the sparks of something that, though dangerous, was also grand. This duality is at the heart of the story. Chaos and order are not enemies, but complementary parts of the same creative process. The music of Eru always included room for error, because without it, there would be no transformation. Ilúvatar himself, upon hearing Morgoth's dissonance, did not destroy it. He absorbed it, creating an even deeper melody. Thus, evil was transformed into part of the greater good. The same is true of the dragons. Their destruction was not an act of negation, but of reintegration. Dissonance returned to the chord. Smaug's fall was not the end of fire, but the moment when fire found a new purpose. It's interesting to observe how this vision is reflected in our own journeys. We all carry within us small dissonances, fears, pride, desires that seem to break the harmony of life. But as in the music of the Ainur, these deviations can be incorporated, transformed, purified. What Tolkien shows through the dragons is that imbalance is part of learning. Chaos, when understood, becomes fuel for evolution. The same fire that destroys also illuminates, and that is why Smaug's death, seen through this lens, is less an end and more a rebirth of the universe itself. The flame that consumed him did not disappear. It returned to the whole, silently rekindling the fabric of creation. The primordial error was redeemed, and the melody flowed freely once more. Every creature, every wind, and every star began to vibrate in unison again, as if the entire world, for the first time in ages, sang at the same frequency. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because if Smaug's death represents the healing of the world's melody, it's necessary to understand who sustained that music. Who were those who, in silence, shaped the harmony of Middle-earth, even when chaos tried to dominate? And this answer leads us to look at an ancient, forgotten people who waged their war not with swords, but with roots, patience, and wisdom. The Entwomen, and the invisible role they played in the final purification of fire. There are stories the wind doesn't tell, only whispers in the crevices of the oldest trees. One of them speaks of the Entwomen, the forgotten guardians of the primordial gardens of Middle-earth. For centuries, people believed they had disappeared, swallowed by time, or consumed by the ashes of war. But the truth is much deeper and more unsettling. They did not disappear, they retreated. And in the silence of this retreat, they prepared a vengeance that used neither blades nor spells, but roots, patience, and ancestral wisdom. While Morgoth's dragons ravaged the valleys, burning forests and turning fields into deserts, the Entwomen watched. They knew that fire could not be defeated with more fire. And so, in a gesture that united compassion and justice, they decided to poison the very soil of Middle-earth to heal the world from chaos. It is said that Javanna, the Valia of fertility and growth, sensed the cries of the burning forests. It was she who granted the Entwomen the gift of silent poison, a power so subtle that dragons would never perceive its approach. The strategy was simple and terrible. Sow plants that seemed harmless, but whose nectar carried an essence destined to weaken the inner fire of the great reptiles. It was not a direct attack, it was a disease of time, a slow sabotage that would act through the earth, water, and air. The dragons, proud and blinded by their own strength, did not notice that with each passing century, their power diminished. The flames became less intense, their flights shorter, their sleep cycles longer. Nature, patient, began to conquer the fire. This invisible war lasted for ages, while armies of men and elves openly fought against the forces of evil. Another conflict raged beneath their feet, silent, unseen. The seeds of the Entwomen scattered across the devastated fields, germinating beneath the ashes. They were small, imperceptible victories. A hill where fire wouldn't catch, a forest that resisted the flames, a river that purified the poison from the air. Morgoth's burning chaos found its antidote in the humility of the earth. And it is almost poetic to realize that the most destructive creatures in the world were defeated not by the strength of warriors, but by the persistence of roots. The slow death of the dragons is therefore more than biological, it is symbolic. It represents the world's return to natural balance. The dragons were the ultimate expression of disorder, ego, power, destruction. The Entwomen, in contrast, represented silent order, unassuming flourishing, wisdom that grows in the dark. When a flute plays too softly, you can't hear the clash of swords, and that is how they won. With each passing century, the dragons slept longer. The flame that once melted mountains began to extinguish itself. The fire turned to ash, the chaos became memory. But this victory came at a price. To poison the fire, the Entwomen had to sacrifice their own form. The oldest stories tell that as they scattered the seeds, they mingled with the earth, becoming one with the soil they wished to protect. Their bodies dissolved into the roots, their spirits merged with the sap. It was an act of total surrender, a kind of sacred suicide. The Entwomen did not die, but ceased to exist as individual beings. Today, it is said that it is still possible to feel their presence in the scent of wildflowers and the gentle swaying of the trees at dusk. The silence of the forest is their voice. This revelation changes how we view the entire mythology of Middle-earth. Because contrary to what many believe, the end of the dragons was not merely a consequence of wars and heroes, but the result of a pact with nature itself. The Entwomen understood something that no other race fully grasped: the power of patience. They knew that time is the greatest of spells, and that the most enduring force is that which does not impose itself, but transforms. While the dragons believed they could dominate the world through fear, the forests learned to wait. And when the last dragon fell, the world fell silent, not in triumph, but in respect. It's possible to imagine the depth of this gesture. Those who loved. Life chose to confront destruction not with violence, but with regeneration. The poison they created was not meant to kill quickly, but to restore balance. The fire of chaos was drained, absorbed by the earth itself. And ironically, the dragons, who always believed themselves to be the masters of matter, were defeated by that which they ignored, the invisible power of growth. The lesson is clear. Every force that attempts to dominate the world through imposition ends up destroyed by the simple act of existence of that which it despises. This story, hidden between the lines of the Elven Chronicles, is also a metaphor for transformation and self-sacrifice. The Entwomen are the symbol of primordial feminine strength, not the strength that dominates, but the strength that sustains. While the dragons roared, they were silent. While chaos advanced, they took root. And perhaps that is why, after the end of the dragons, the world was never the same again. Nature had won, but at the cost of losing its oldest voices. It is the paradox of harmony. For balance to exist, something must disappear. When Smaug fell, the last breath of that ancient poison completed its cycle. The dragon's body, once invincible, was already weakened by centuries of decay. Bard's blow was merely the final spark of a plan that had begun long before any hero wielded a sword. The true battle was won in silence, among roots and seeds, in the darkness of the earth. And this explains why, after Smaug's fall, the great flames of the world never burned with the same intensity again. The fire was purified, but the voices that calmed it were lost forever. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the sacrifice of the Ent women not only transformed Middle-earth, but also altered the very destiny of the creatures that came after them. The disappearance of those guardians opened the way for a new kind of power, an invisible spiritual power that began to shape the world from within. And understanding this change is understanding what truly happened to the essence of the dragons after their death, and why their echo can still be heard in the shadows of the mountains and in the whisper of the wind. There are promises that do not die with time. They transcend ages, kingdoms, and even death. The oath of Gil-galad and Elendil, sealed in the flames of the last alliance, was one of those vows that transcended the realm of men and touched the deepest fibers of creation. When the two kings raised their swords before Eru-Ilúvatar, they vowed that evil in all its forms would be pursued until the end of time. What few realized is that this oath was not limited to Sauron or the visible armies of Mordor. It echoed in the fabric of reality, spreading like an invisible wave over everything that had been shaped by Morgoth's touch. And this included the dragons, the oldest and proudest creatures of chaos. The fall of Smaug, therefore, was no mere accident. It was the fulfillment of an ancient sentence pronounced in the background of the world's own history. To understand this curse, one must look beyond battles and crowns. When Gil-galad and Elendil sealed their alliance, they were not merely uniting peoples, they were realigning the harmony of Middle-earth with the will of Eru. Their oaths became more than words, they became living forces etched into destiny. In symbolic language, such oaths are chords that reverberate in the heart of the music of the Ainur. Eru, in his wisdom, did not annul them, but transformed them into spiritual laws. Every creature corrupted by the shadow, from orcs to dragons, came to bear an invisible seal, the promise that one day it would face the judgment of the light. Dragons, by their very nature, believed themselves above such laws. Forged from primordial fire, indirect offspring of Morgoth's rebellion, they despised any authority that was not their own power. Glaurung, Ankalagon, and Smaug saw the gods not as judges, but as rivals. However, the king's oath was no ordinary spell. It was a pact made in absolute purity, and like every truth spoken before Eru, it became inevitable. Centuries passed, empires crumbled, but the vibration of that promise continued. The entire world became the instrument that would perform this melody of justice. In each age, the oath manifested itself differently. In the tides that swallowed wicked kingdoms, in the winds that extinguished corrupt civilizations, and finally, in the arrows that struck invincible monsters. When Bard fired the black bolt that pierced Smaug's heart, he was not merely avenging his people, he was, unknowingly, being the final instrument of an ancient oath. The bow that supported the arrow, the wind that guided it, the moment of silence before impact, all were part of the same purpose that had been being prepared since the First Age. The universe does not act by chance. It fulfills what has been promised. What makes this story even more fascinating is the duality of its nature. The curse of the kings was not only destructive, it was also redemptive. Each time a creature of darkness fell, a part of the lost harmony was restored. And that is why the death of the dragons, though tragic, was necessary. They represented the fire that defied the Creator, the spark of pride that refused repentance. Their extinction was the final chapter of the promise made in time immemorial, the reconciliation between light and corrupted fire. Behind the scenes of this, Narrative lies an almost forgotten detail. Gil-galad and Elendil were not merely warriors, they were conduits of a spiritual force that few understood. It is said that when they swore before Eru, a star shone with abnormal intensity, and that this same brilliance reappeared centuries later when Smaug fell. Coincidence? Hard to believe in a world where even music possesses consciousness. The star was a reminder. No promise made in the name of light is ever lost. It simply awaits the right moment to be fulfilled. The great curses of Arda always carry an element of choice, and this one was no different. Throughout the ages, dragons could have hidden themselves, dissolved into oblivion, or even abandoned the inner fire that made them dangerous. But, driven by their own arrogance, they remained active, guarding treasures, defying gods, and ridiculing the balance of the world. Thus, they brought upon themselves the weight of the prophecy. Pride was the true trigger of the sentence. Smaug, in his final flight over Esgaroth, faced not only men, he faced the consequence of a promise made long before he existed. It's curious to think that even evil must fulfill its assigned role. Morgoth, in creating the dragons, believed he was breaking the cycle of creation, but in reality he only strengthened the purpose of light. The oath of the ancient kings transformed the very act of rebellion into a path to purification. In other words, each dragon slain was a part of the shadow being brought back into balance. Chaos, however devastating, never escaped the greater melody. This symbolic reading reveals a hidden truth about Tolkien's universe. Destiny is never just punishment, it's learning. The end of the dragons shows that even the most destructive forces are part of a transformative process. Smaug's death was not only the closing of an era, but a silent reminder that no force can eternally resist the flow of harmony. The fire he used to destroy was the same that consumed his soul. And when his ashes fell upon the waters, they mingled with the world he had tried to dominate, dissolving into that which he had always tried to deny, the whole. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because if the Oath of Kings truly shaped the destiny of all corrupted creatures, it's possible that it also affected the very spirits of the dragons after death. And perhaps what we call extinction isn't the absolute end, but the beginning of a new kind of existence, a spiritual transmutation that connects the ancient flame of chaos to the ultimate harmony of creation. There is a profound mystery hidden within the shining stones. The Arkenstone, the Silmarils, the elven jewels, all share something that goes far beyond beauty or material value. They are living fragments of a light that came from the beginning of time, echoes of the undying fire that Eru Ilúvatar kindled to give form to creation. When the elves carved their jewels, they were not merely creating art. They were capturing splashes of this primordial light, fixing in matter something that by nature should be eternal. And that is why dragons were so drawn to them. Gold nourished them, but the stones fascinated them. It was in them that they felt the world's most ancient warmth, the silent vibration of the divine spark they had lost when they were created from the corruption of Morgoth. The brilliance of these stones was not a mere reflection. It was breath, a subtle, almost imperceptible, yet real pulse, as if the jewels were tiny hearts beating to the rhythm of creation. Those who have stood before one described a curious sensation, a shiver that came not from fear, but from memory. It was as if the stones whispered memories of what the world was before the fall, before the shadow. Perhaps that is why the dragons lay upon them with such zeal. Sleeping upon these stones, enveloped in mountains of gold and light, they unconsciously sought what they could never recover, the lost connection to the undying fire. Smaug, the last of the great dragons, understood this mystery in his own way. His treasure was not merely a symbol of greed, but an unconscious sanctuary. At the center of that cave, beneath the weight of countless coins, lay something alive, the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain. It emanated a glow that no fire could reproduce, a cold, eternal light that seemed to silently observe the world. Smaug did not know it, but he slept upon the last link between the corrupted fire of his kind and the purity of divine fire. That stone was a reminder of what dragons had been before the fall, the reflection of a flame that no longer belonged to them. The dwarves called it the heart of the world, and perhaps they were right, because the Arkenstone was not just a gem, it was an amphora of spiritual energy. It carried within it the same principle as the Silmarils, the imprisonment of a light that should never have been imprisoned. This was always the tragedy of perfect creations, transforming the infinite into something tangible. And every time one of these lights was surrounded by stone walls, something in the balance of the universe was broken. Nature cannot bear the imprisonment of eternity. That is why the sacred stones attracted both covetousness and misfortune. They were beacons and curses at the same time. When Thorin found the Arkenstone, its brilliance awakened something dormant within him, the same impulse that had destroyed so many before him. Divine light, when touched by mortal hands, reveals the best and worst of the heart. In Thorin's case, it revealed obsession, pride, and blindness. And it was precisely this blindness that sealed the fate not only of him, but of the entire dragon lineage. When the Arkenstone was buried with his body in the depths of Erebor, the last accessible fragment of the undying fire was sealed forever. The cycle was broken. The bridge between divine fire and corrupted fire was destroyed. This act, which seemed merely a gesture of funeral honor, had cosmic consequences. The stones that whispered light ceased to speak. The spiritual glow of the world weakened. The fire of the dragons, which was already dying, lost its resonance altogether. It was as if Middle-earth had lost one of its heartbeats. The silence that followed Smaug's death was not merely an absence of noise, it was an absence of vibration. A kind of emptiness that even the elves felt, though they could not name it. It was the moment when the music of the world became a little quieter, less alive. And perhaps this is the bitterest irony of the story. The same gold and jewels that brought about the dragon's ruin were in fact what kept them connected to creation. By destroying everything they touched, they extinguished the only vestige of divinity that still existed within them. The fire that once fueled them turned against itself, and the stones, without guardians to protect them, fell asleep. But the world, as always, moved on. The brilliance that was once visible began to hide in other forms, in the water, in the stars, in the souls of the peoples who inherited Middle-earth. The light did not disappear, it merely changed address. Some say that on very clear nights, when the wind blows from the north and the sky curves over the mountains, it is possible to hear the echo of the stones. An almost inaudible sound, a whisper of light vibrating in the air like the chord of a distant harp. Perhaps it is just the wind. Perhaps it is the memory of the Arkenstone calling back what was lost. The fact is that no true light dies, it only transforms, awaiting the moment when it will be perceived again. The fascination with these stones was never about wealth, but about belonging. Every being that looked at them felt, even without understanding, a longing that could not be explained. A longing for a time when creation was still intact, when fire and light danced in harmony. The dragons, with all their strength, were unable to sustain this bond, but paradoxically, they were the last to feel it in all its intensity. Perhaps that is why they slept so much, because in their dreams they could still hear the stones whispering. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject because the silence of these stones after the end of the dragons didn't just signify the end of an era. It marked the beginning of a spiritual transformation in Middle-earth, an invisible change that affected the fate of kings, wizards, and even the spirits that still wandered between worlds. And understanding this transition is to comprehend how the very essence of light began to move from within the stones into the souls. There are forces that need no swords to dominate the world. Sometimes, the most terrifying power is the unseen one, which silently infiltrates the mind and transforms thought into a prison. This was Sauron's gift, the same poisoned gift he inherited from Morgoth, and perfected like no other, while armies marched and the towers of Mordor rose. A far deeper war was being waged, invisible and constant, a war of influence, perception, and fear. Sauron understood that true control lay not in chains, but in thoughts. And when he began to use the Palantiri, those stones of sight created by the elves of Aman, he transformed them into instruments of mental domination. Through them, he cast a web of shadows that spread like a spiritual disease, contaminating kings, wizards, and even creatures believed to be beyond the reach of any mortal mind. This influence, as subtle as the wind itself, also reached the dragons, creatures that by nature already carried the burden of pride and distrust, became perfect targets for manipulation. Sauron didn't need to confront them directly. It was enough to feed them visions, desires, and paranoia. Using the Palantiri, he projected images of betrayal, of invisible enemies, of threatened treasures. And the most fascinating thing is that the dragons believed they were protecting themselves, when in reality they were becoming prisoners of the influence that corroded them from within. Smaug is the clearest example of this process. For centuries he amassed riches, gold, and precious stones, believing he would find security in them. But little by little, his mind began to unravel. What was once cunning turned into distrust. What was once ambition transformed into paranoia. He saw enemies everywhere, felt the gold watching him as if it were alive. He spent entire days in silence, immersed in a feverish trance, as if he heard voices that no one else could hear. Many believed it was just greed, but there was something deeper. The psychic influence of Sauron vibrating in every spark of his consciousness. Sauron's manipulation was almost artistic. He knew that fear is the most enduring weapon. It needs no maintenance, no presence. Once sown, it grows on its own. The dragons, despite their power, were not immune to it. The fire that burned on the outside was a reflection of the fire that consumed them from within. Over the centuries, the invisible poison began to corrode their essence. Their flames became more volatile, their dreams more disturbing. Many fell asleep and never awoke again. Others were lost in the mountains, driven mad by the constant feeling that someone was watching them. Smaug, the last and most powerful among them, was the one who resisted the longest, but also the one who suffered the most. Every night, his mind returned to the visions that tormented him, a flaming eye, always awake, probing his thoughts. That is why, when Bilbo entered his cave, Smaug was no longer the invincible dragon of ancient times. He was a weary creature, corroded by distrust, surrounded by a treasure that no longer brought him pleasure, but anguish. Gold had become his prison. He slept under his own curse. Sauron's influence over dragons reveals something fascinating about the nature of power. He doesn't need to destroy to win. He only needs to corrupt. This is how he overthrew kings without wielding a sword, corrupted wizards without casting a spell, and drove immortal creatures mad without ever touching them. Mental domination was his true empire, and the dragons, unknowingly, became part of this invisible network. Every thought of covetousness, every act of distrust fueled the same vibration that sustained the eye of Sauron. The entire world, to a greater or lesser degree, breathed within this cycle of manipulation. But every influence, however profound, has a breaking point. When Smaug fell, the echo of his death reverberated far beyond Erebor. It was as if a hidden frequency had been suddenly interrupted. The sound of his final roar echoed not only through the mountains, it pierced the layers of the invisible, breaking the last link in the chain that bound ancient creatures to the mind of Morgoth. Smaug's death freed Middle-earth from the last vibration of this ancient influence. The air felt lighter, and, though few consciously realized it, the world breathed a sigh of relief. This liberation, however, did not happen in a pure way. All purification is accompanied by trauma. The space left by the breaking of the chain also opened breaches, places of spiritual emptiness where new forms of power could emerge. The collective mind of Middle-earth, previously dominated by fear, fell silent for the first time in ages. And silence is fertile ground for transformation, but also for return. The disappearance of the dragons and the fall of Sauron's direct influence did not mean the end of darkness, but its change of form. The mental power that was once concentrated in colossal creatures began to disperse among peoples, artifacts, and ideas. There is a hidden truth in this process. Evil, when broken, never completely disappears. It fragments, and each fragment seeks a new vessel, a new way of existing. That is why, even after Smaug's death, the shadow continued to live in human hearts, in fragile alliances, in decisions made out of fear. The psychic poison that once corrupted the dragons continued to act on the subtle structures of the world. It merely changed form. What makes this story so powerful is the mirror it offers us. Sauron's control wasn't physical but psychological. He represented the power of ideas that imprison, of fears that transform into invisible walls. Smaug, with all his strength, was a victim of this, and his death, though tragic, was also an act of liberation. When he fell, Middle-earth recovered a fragment of itself, a part that had been taken by the dominion of the mind. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Sauron's mental influence didn't disappear with Smaug's body. It infiltrated subsequent ages, shaping kings, wizards, and even the decisions of those who believed they were fighting for the light. Understanding this invisible legacy is understanding how power continues to act, even when the enemy no longer has a face. They say the world fell silent when Smaug fell. Not the usual silence, the kind that follows a battle or a thunderclap, but a kind of cosmic pause, as if creation itself had held its breath. The dragon tumbled upon the waters, and in them dissolved the last vestige of a power that existed before the mountains, before the seas, and before the stars. His body burned until his last breath, and the vapor that rose was not merely smoke, it was the departing soul of an era. Many believed that only the story of a monster ended there, but those who knew the ancient songs knew that something far greater had happened. The thread that connected the dragons to the primordial fire, to the spark stolen by Morgoth, had finally been broken. The elders of the elves called this moment the Night of the Last Echo. They said that when Smaug's body sank, the whole world felt a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor, like the last chord of a song too long for mortals to understand. Smaug's fall was not a simple physical event, but a spiritual conclusion. The dragons did not die merely in flesh. Their souls were bound to the very dissonance that Morgoth had introduced into the music of the Ainur. And when the last of them disappeared, this dissonance finally found rest. What few realized is that this death did not signify destruction, but transformation. Ancient legends from the sages of Aman tell that dragons carried a fire that did not belong to them, a fragment of the undying fire, corrupted and shaped by hatred. When Smaug was defeated, this flame did not simply go out, it was set free. The fire rose to the heavens, and for an instant the north wind shimmered with golden and red hues, as if the air remembered its own origin. It was the spark attempting to return to the harmony from which it had been torn millennia ago. The universe has its way of healing the wounds that pride inflicts, and Smaug's last flight was, paradoxically, an act of healing. The draconic spirits, those fiery echoes of creation, were dragged into the void, along with Morgoth, their creator and tyrant. And there, on the threshold between being and nothingness, they remained dormant, enveloped in the webs of oblivion. Many believe that this spiritual imprisonment was the just price for having set the world ablaze. Others, however, see in it a gesture of compassion. Because perhaps even corrupted fire needs to be remembered for balance to exist. Absolute destruction would extinguish not only evil, but also the memory of what good had to overcome. There's a lost passage in the elven songs that describes something intriguing. It says that the sound of Smaug's last roar was not only heard, but felt. The trees trembled, the waters shook, and even the mountains, those same mountains that witnessed the forging of Ankalagan and the fall of Morgoth, vibrated as if an ancient memory were being erased. In that instant, the world became a little lighter, but also emptier. The raw force of chaos was gone, and in its place remained a melancholy, almost sacred silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes the birth of something new. The free peoples celebrated, but the wizards understood what it meant. An era had closed. The world had lost not only an enemy, but also a part of itself, the mirror of its own shadow. Because, in essence, dragons represented the deepest reflection of creation, the power to shape and destroy, to warm and consume. Without them, Middle-earth became more stable, but also less alive. Balance had been restored, but at the cost of mystery. From that moment on, fire ceased to be sacred and became simply fire. Even so, some voices say that not all is lost. On cold nights, when the wind cuts through the valleys and the sky seems to fold in on itself, some swear they hear a distant roar coming from the north, low, almost a whisper, but laden with an ancient force. Some believe it is merely the wind beating in the caves. Others say it is the echo of Smaug, the last vestige of primordial fire still seeking a way back to the song of the world. Perhaps it is no coincidence that this sound is only heard on the quietest nights when the earth seems suspended between dream and memory. The wisest say that fire never disappears, it only changes form. And the same is true for the soul. When Smaug fell, the universe did not lose its fire, it merely returned it to the place from which it should never have left. This idea, which blends faith and philosophy, is repeated to this day by scholars of Valinor. Nothing that has been created is extinguished, it only returns. Thus, the death of the last dragon was not a punishment, but a return to the origin. The fire that burned within Smaug became once again part of the great flame that moves the stars. The melancholy of this ending is not one of sadness, but of reverence. Because understanding the fate of dragons is understanding the cycle of creation itself, birth, fall, and reunion. Everything that burns one day goes out, but the heat it leaves behind continues traveling, traversing eras, and transforming into new forms of life, courage, and beauty. That is why, even in times of peace, there is something in the hearts of men that still stirs when they look at fire. Perhaps it is an ancestral memory, the echo of when fire spoke. The dragons are gone, but their spiritual presence has never completely disappeared. in every spark that rises from a forge, in every lightning bolt that tears across the sky, there is a fragment of the same fire that once gave life to Smaug. Perhaps the universe needs this reminder not to forget what the power and the danger of creation is. Because fire is, ultimately, the image of transformation itself. It illuminates, but also consumes. It warms, but also destroys. It gives form, but demands sacrifice. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because if the dragons truly disappeared only in body, what happened to their souls? Did they dissolve into the void, or find a new path within the very music of creation? Perhaps the echo that still resonates in the mountains is more than a memory. Perhaps it is a sign that the primordial fire still dreams of awakening. And if you've made it this far, perhaps that ancient fire has also ignited something within you, that silent curiosity to understand what lies behind the stories, what remains alive even when everything seems to have ended. That's why this space exists, for us to walk together through these mysteries between myth and truth. So, if this journey has made you think, leave a comment saying where you're listening from and what time it is there now. I like to imagine in what part of the world that flame still burns. And if this conversation brought you any revelation, a new perspective, leave a like. It's the simplest way to keep this exchange alive. There's a video here that complements this theme and delves even deeper into this story. Click and continue with me there, because the next part of this journey will take you even deeper.